Same time, Mzansi has criticized President Cyril Ramaphosa's peace mission to Ukraine and Russia. The political movement describes the mission as an unmitigated disaster that will yield nothing. For more on this, we're joined by Mzansi leader Songezo Zibi. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. While you're calling it an unmitigated disaster, the president is stamping his foot. He says it was a success. He's repeated it again now with the European leaders that were joining him earlier on, saying, amongst other things, we called for the de-escalation of fighting and for negotiations to commence with urgency.
So I think that the president has still not described how this was a success to begin with, because merely visiting Ukraine and speaking to Ukraine's president and being told that Ukraine is busy with its counteroffensive, and then moving on to Russia and being told by President Putin that the effort is misguided, I don't think that that is a success at all. The visit and this attempt, while well-meaning, is ill-timed, because in terms of how you negotiate an end to international conflict, there's certain pre-work that needs to be done, which was not done. Secondly, you do not try and negotiate peace without the support of major allies of the parties that are involved in a war. And thirdly, you do not do it at a time when both sides feel that there is still a path to military victory. It was ill-timed, poorly set up, and lastly, you don't bring a whole horde of journalists to a first attempt. Nobody does that, except our president.
Others are saying, well, I mean, in terms of the African continent, at least showing some kind of interest in international conflict, this was a good start. Maybe we lack what is required, as you put it, in terms of conflict resolution and international peacekeeping efforts, but certainly that African leaders came together and went and articulated Africa's position as far as this war and how it affects the continent could have been a win in itself.
So, Thabo, there is no doubt that, I mean, what the Danish and I think it's the Netherlands Prime Minister said is really trite. It's what every diplomat would say in a situation like this, because nobody wants war, for instance. There is also no doubt that Africa is really negatively affected by the war, and the war happened because Russia invaded Ukraine, something that South Africa is still unable to call it what it is in terms of what has happened. But here's something that viewers need to understand. Negotiations succeed only when the parties that offer active support to those involved in war are supportive of the peace effort. That means securing the support of the United States, securing the support of China, securing the support of the United Kingdom, and so on. Because they can bring pressure to bear on Ukraine and Russia. There is something called leverage. If you have nothing to offer and nothing to withdraw or hold back, in order to kind of softly coerce the parties to negotiate, you have no leverage at all and you are wasting your time. What we needed to do was to work through the Chinese, work through the United States and the United Kingdom, because they can successfully put pressure on Russia and Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. This was a PR exercise and it failed.
So let's talk, for example, about one of the calls called to de-escalate fighting. How do you de-escalate fighting in an instance of this nature where both sides believe they are winning? I mean, at this particular point, I suppose Ukraine also believes we're getting more arms. We still have got arms. We are winning some parts back. Russia is also working on new weapons, and they also have their nuclear weapons, saying we can deploy them anytime. So both sides still feel they can win this war.
Absolutely, Thabo. This is the problem. You do not try and negotiate a peace when both sides have a lot of fight in them. That is not to say you do nothing, but you have to understand that your chances of success are slim. That is the first thing. The second thing, Thabo, is that there was a poor sort of execution of statecraft here. President Cyril Ramaphosa talks about trust-building measures. Trust-building measures are not done by heads of state. They're done by emissaries, working in confidence, that is confidentially, shuttling between the various capitals that have got leverage on the situation. That is the first thing. The second level of trust-building measures is being able to convince the Ukrainians to take certain steps to de-escalate, convincing the Russians to withdraw from certain territories and say, in good faith, the two sides have taken trust-building measures. We can have a ceasefire in place and so on, and therefore we can set a framework for negotiations and so on. Nothing of the sort. The president still has not said what the two parties have agreed to by way of a framework for negotiations. If anything, the Russians fired missiles into Kyiv while our president was there. If that's not a direct message to say, you don't matter, I don't care for you, I don't know what else is waiting for.
So another call is for the prisoners of war to be released is one, and of course the other one is for the return of children. Firstly, prisoners of war, I suppose, in a war situation is something that is generally done. They are released to and fro. I think they released a couple of them just the other day. But the return of children in itself has got a lot of implications, because Russia says, well, we're actually saving these children from continuous bombardment. And Ukraine is saying, no, you must return our children. These are our children. And when you're calling for the return of the children, are you, by any chance, I suppose, revealing where you're leaning towards and who you're believing in this conflict?
No, actually, you're also showing extraordinary naivete, Thabo. So you return the children to where? To the war zone. Firstly, why were they taken to begin with? So one of the reasons South Africa is not trusted by the Ukrainians is because they fail to call the things by their name. So one of the reasons President Vladimir Putin has been charged with war crimes by the ICC is a forcible removal of children and separation from their parents and taking them to Russia. Now, we are asking for Russia to return the children for a crime we say never happened. So if you talk about trust-building measures, you can't walk on opposite sides of the street in different directions if you want people to trust you. But in effect, that is what we're doing. It is extraordinary, Thabo, that we're even having this conversation about something that was a PR exercise. This should have been the period in which someone in our government and in the other governments was shuttling between Washington and Beijing and India and other countries that have got an influence on the situation, so that eventually you set up a situation where the head of state can visit, and if they are journalists, you've got something to show for it. The purpose of this trip is difficult to understand because there is nothing to show for it at all. And by the way, Ukraine and Russia have exchanged prisoners of war about 18 times already. So I'm not sure what new thing we're trying to negotiate there.
But certainly if you look at the optics and how they played out, others looked, for example, at the body language of Russian President Vladimir Putin to the African leaders versus how Ukraine, for example, responded to them and in a sense interpreted that as some kind of message being sent also to the West to say, well, you can't really dictate who's going to be our friend.
No, look, I mean, all of that is really just cheap politics, by the way, Thabo, because it ultimately doesn't really mean anything of substance. Let's look at what happened in Ukraine. Just one thing that's notable that happened. The African countries have refused to acknowledge the war crimes accusation against President Putin. So all the Ukrainians did was to use our president and his counterparts for PR. They took them to Bucha, where a lot of the war crimes are said to have happened. They made sure there were cameras there. They paraded them around, showed them what happened, and then told them that, sorry, we don't buy into your piece. Not at this stage when we're still trying to take territory back. You should have been here a year ago. You said nothing. And now that we're beginning to fight back, you want us to stop fighting. Right? That's really, to be brutally honest, that's what happened in Ukraine. Then off they went to Russia. And the Russian president, according to the Lusaka Times, was interrupting the leaders when they were making their opening remarks and telling them that their efforts are misguided. We must stop behaving like to use young people's language, the ice boys of big countries. And they went there to be disrespected on both sides. And it's unseemly and poorly conceived, and they shouldn't have done it in this way.
Yeah. But why is this war important? Why is this conflict important for African nations? I mean, it's not far removed because we're already beginning to see the impact of it. And therefore, is there something tangible that we can work together, at least to prevent our own suffering in this conflict?
So there are two main things, or three main things, by the way, Thabo, that are important. The first one is the disruption of the world energy market and the price of oil and gas. And South Africa is a net importer of oil and gas, and we've seen the impact on inflation that has had. So that is the first thing, and it's true in many other African countries. That's a very material impact that affects your life and my life and the lives of yours. The second thing has been Ukraine and parts of Russia are part of the world's garden in terms of grain, which has been held up. Production is much lower. The export of this grain is usually hampered by the conflict and so on. And although there is a grain export arrangement, the reality is that because there is war in the Donbass, where a lot of this comes from, the amount of the grain that's going to be exported is less, which pushes food prices up, and many African countries are poor. That's the second one. The last one is fertilizer, which comes from Ukraine and Russia. This whole war has disturbed the supply of that as well. All of this has got an impact on food prices, cost of living, and the kind of hardship that African countries go through. So this war, which was started by Russia, is a problem, right? And we all agree it needs to come to an end. But in doing that, we must not make buffoons of our countries and the African continent in the manner that it has been done.
Yeah. Somebody said in my conversation, I think earlier in the week, that ultimately in the end, Africa will be proven right and will be on the right side of history, because ultimately what's going to end this conflict is negotiation. While the West believes, of course, the only way to resolve issues is through the barrel of the gun. But ultimately, Africa will get this one right, I suppose.
90% of all wars, Thabo, end in negotiations. There is no new idea there. Come on. What are they saying? The South African conflict ended in negotiation. The Angolan conflict ended in negotiation. The Mozambican conflict ended in negotiation. The Namibian war ended in negotiation. What is there to prove right? It's a historical fact that the most destructive wars that end in a military victory kill a lot of people. Of course, Africa is right, but even a high school student would be right in that respect.
Ultimately, I mean, what is going to be left behind in this is the mess that we saw playing out in Poland, more than, I suppose, what is the benefit coming out of this particular visit. And certainly that is going to be a big challenge for President Cyril Ramaphosa here at home now.
Yeah, and look, the tragic thing is that, I mean, as much of impact as this has on South Africa and the African continent, poor execution harms us. It harms all of us, because you've got a so-called peace effort which yields nothing. I really believe that we should all work for peace, but it is not possible to work for peace if the countries that supply the weapons are not part of the deal. You understand, Thabo? It's so logical, it's painful. And we are involved in a diplomatic spat with the Americans. The ANC in particular continually insults the West and so on and accuses them of all manner of things. At the same time, to succeed in your mission, Thabo, you need these same countries to listen to you when you say, please don't supply any more weapons to the conflict, right? You can't do both. You can't try and persuade and insult at the same time, which is what we do. It makes no sense. Yeah.
This new verse and chorus, the anti-South Africa sentiment in Poland, how far would that go?
It's nonsense. So let me tell you what most likely happened here. President Cyril Ramaphosa and his close protection services arrangements are done by the South African Air Force because they run Inkwas. The arrangements in terms of everybody else who's not normally on the trip were done by Bekicele's people and the SAPS, who are not used to doing this kind of thing. The paperwork wasn't right. The one part of the delegation was able to do absolutely everything they wanted to do. They could go anywhere they liked except this one plane. What is anti-South African there? What about the Zambians? What about the Congolese and so on? How come they were able to move around and do what they wanted to do? We must stop trying to feel like a special victim where it's not warranted. The people that need to account is Wally Rude and everybody else about why they did not have the correct paperwork when they needed to have one. The Air Force did its job, and it was a perfect job, and the president was able to get wherever he needed to be.
Mzansi leader, Songezo Zibi, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on tonight. There you are, an unmitigated disaster, he says, this trip by the president to Russia and Ukraine.